As we saw earlier this week, Afghanistan and Iraq featured conflicts. However, there will be a part 2 to both wars. As you remember, in Afghanistan, after the Soviets were defeated and expelled from Afghanistan, a group called the Taliban took over. And this is a radical, terror-based Islamic group. Some of these Taliban were former Mujahideen, warriors of God, and they were all very religiously conservative and very ultra-violent. So life will change in Afghanistan with this ultra-violent and ultra-conservative religious group now in charge as their government. The West, and the United States in particular, will become a target of the Taliban because they don't like A, what the United States stands for, and that it stands for freedom and democracy, and B, they believe that the United States only helped Afghanistan in the Cold War to defeat the Soviet Union, which is absolutely true. Now, about this time, in the late 1990s, a group called Al-Qaeda, which is a global terrorist group, was created and is founded by a guy called Osama bin Laden. Now, Osama bin Laden is from Saudi Arabia, and he follows this sect of Islam called the Al-Wahhabi sect. And basically this means it's the most strict sect of Islam of them all, and they don't even like other groups within Islam. So that means they hate members of other religions. It's very conservative. Basically, they want to go back to the days of the Prophet Muhammad 1,500 years ago, and if it didn't exist when he was alive, then they shouldn't be using it, or they shouldn't believe it. So it's just a very strict and rigid version of Islam. Here's a picture of Osama bin Laden, and as you recall from the last video, he was a Mujahideen fighter who the United States supported in the Soviet-Afghan War. He supported the Taliban in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan, and he was forced to leave Saudi Arabia in 1992, and so he makes Afghanistan his home. These attacks really began in 1993 when Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center. This is a very creepy topic because we all know what happened in 9/11 in 2001. But basically what they did was they had a truck full of bombs, and they somehow were able to park it deep in the basement levels, sort of a parking lot level, and they blew it up, and it caused incredible damage. The tower survived, but many people were killed. And this is really the first instance in the 1990s where the United States can recall being attacked by a foreign country, a foreign terrorist group. And this is blurry, but what you can kind of see here is how the truck was able to get down into the basement levels, and then it exploded. Now, the late 90s were a terrible time for terrorist attacks around the world, and Al-Qaeda claims credit for all of them. In 1998, a pair of U.S. embassies in Africa will be absolutely destroyed. This one in Kenya, and this one in Tanzania. Now further, not too far off of the coast of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf, an American battleship called the USS Cole was attacked by a suicide bomber, basically a suicide boat, and this killed many American sailors, and it hurt even more. You can see right here the damage that it did. This is a graphic, so you can see really where it was attacked, really off the coast of Yemen, close to Somalia, and you can also see exactly where it's attacked on the boat. And this is the damage that was done in this attack. You can see it better in this close-up photograph. You want to hear a fun fact about the USS Cole? Okay, my third grade teacher in elementary school, her son is a naval commander, and he was actually serving as an officer on this boat when it got attacked. Now, the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history has to be what happened in 2001 on September 11th. And that's when Al-Qaeda were able to train about 21 terrorists who got on 4 different airplanes, hijacked the planes, and then actually flew the planes into different targets in the United States. 2 of the planes would hit the 2 World Trade Center buildings right here. One of these buildings was the same building that was attacked in 1993. There was another plane that hit the Pentagon. You'll see that picture in a second. And then a 4th plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania, and a lot of people believe that that plane was headed for the White House. All in all, about 3,000 people were killed on this day. This is the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C. This is where the Secretary of Defense has his office. So basically, this is where the United States plans its wars and keeps its country safe. And you can see right here where the plane hit, killing many people in the Pentagon complex. Now, the president at the time had only been president for about 6 months, and his name is George W. Bush. And this is what's called Ground Zero. If you've been to New York City, you know exactly what this is, and you know that they have rebuilt the World Trade Center and as sort of a monument to the victims of that attack. And in this singular move in his presidency, George W. Bush goes down to Ground Zero, and he addresses the rescue workers and the crowds who are nearby.
Thank you all. Get him, George! I want you all to know, you can't go any louder. I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you! I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
So in this speech, by promising that, we really see that the United States is about to go to war to punish those who started this attack. Now the text is sort of cut off here, but on the left you have Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. On the right you have the President of the United States, George W. Bush, and in late 2001, the War on Terror began. Now, since Osama bin Laden planned his attack from Afghanistan, Afghanistan would be the first target. So the United States would demand from the Taliban that they turn in Osama bin Laden or face war. The Taliban wanted neither option, and so they say that they asked bin Laden to leave. However, they don't know where he is, and they couldn't help the United States, which means war. In an operation called Operation Enduring Freedom, the United States quickly launched some lightning attacks into Afghanistan, eventually followed by a ground invasion of military soldiers who would occupy Afghanistan for about 8 years. One of the topics that people often forget is just how bad 9/11 was for Muslims living in the United States. Because during this time period, since Al-Qaeda is a radical Muslim group, people in the United States very easily mistook all Muslims as radical Muslims. So there's a lot of hate crimes, there's a lot of hate speech, and generally this is just a very hard time to be a Muslim in the United States. This is very similar to what I just said. At the same time, the United States is preparing to invade Iraq. Now, some of you have a hard time understanding this. A lot of Americans have a hard time understanding this. But basically, the United States claimed that Iraq was part of the terror problem, and by declaring war on all terrorists, Iraq should be attacked. We all remember Saddam Hussein. We all remember the terrible things that he did in Iran and to the Kurds and to the Kuwaiti peoples. So, yes, he is a bad guy, and he is a dictator who's committed genocides. The United States claimed that he was storing and making weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, nuclear weapons, and that these would be used for terrorism. And so the United States will invade Iraq to try to prevent that from happening. Just like 12 years earlier, the United States went to the United Nations to gain support. And this is Colin Powell, who's the Secretary of State, who is a former Army general who served in the first Gulf War. The problem this time is that the United Nations was not convinced by the United States or Colin Powell's argument. And so the United States Security Council will not sanction or allow an invasion. The United States does it anyway and builds a much smaller coalition than in 1990, 1991. The goal of the second Gulf War will be much different than that of Operation Desert Storm. In Operation Desert Storm, as you remember, the only mission was to remove Iraq from Kuwait. In the second Gulf War, or Operation Iraqi Freedom, the goal was to invade Iraq, remove Saddam Hussein from power, and replace his government with a democracy. So to go to war in Iraq, again, you have a much smaller coalition called the Coalition of the Willing. As the United Nations didn't sanction this, there are fewer countries who are willing to sort of stick their neck out. In the first Gulf War, there were 33 or 34 countries. In the second Gulf War, 21 of those countries declined to fight. So the United States has to work a lot harder to get allies in order to invade Iraq. One of the big things, and if you look at this map, you can see it, there are very few Arab countries who were willing to help out. Another thing that's interesting, the United States will claim to have even more countries helping them, 49 versus 33 or 34 from the first Gulf War. However, not all of those countries who have joined actually have a military. So they may be providing assistance in terms of money or strategy, but they don't actually have a military. Now, if you look very carefully, you can see one country who stuck their neck out to help the United States in this exercise, and that is El Salvador. Like we've seen in other countries, you could even say the Soviets when they invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the United States did very well when they invaded Iraq in 2003. They overwhelmed Iraq with superior military power in this campaign called Shock and Awe. Here are some of the news magazines from that era. And you really have to go back into World War II or perhaps the Korean War or the Vietnam War to see an air attack this devastating. However, this doesn't guarantee victory. As you can see here, we've seen this monument before. This was the monument in the Iran-Iraq War in Baghdad, Iraq. You can see that the Americans have actually invaded Iraq versus in the first Gulf War, they left Saddam Hussein alone, hoping that his people would overthrow him. Much like the Soviets when they invaded Afghanistan, the United States really was able to win battles in cities fairly effectively. However, once they really got inside Iraq and it had established themselves, then the difficulties began because of a guerrilla resistance of the Iraqis. As well, the United States didn't have a clear what's called exit strategy. So they knew what they wanted to do, but they didn't actually know how they would eventually leave Iraq. If there was a battle on the battlefield, the United States would win because they were better equipped and better trained than the Iraqi army. However, most of the time, the battles weren't on a battlefield. Instead, there were these little guerrilla attacks, such as IEDs, or improvised explosive devices, which are these little hidden bombs that would explode on people or if a caravan or a military vehicle were to roll over it on the road. And so the effect here is even more devastating simply because there's this constant fear. President George W. Bush was heavily criticized for this speech. And if you look, this is on an aircraft carrier in San Diego in the fall of 2003. And he really took criticism for the banner that's at the what's called the bridge of the ship. And it says mission accomplished. Now, this is in 2003. The United States doesn't leave Iraq until 2011. So obviously the mission wasn't accomplished, yet they were claiming victory when victory had not even taken place. So this would be an embarrassing moment for the United States moving forward. Now, an interesting wrinkle in all of this is that Saddam Hussein just happened to disappear, and nobody can find him. Until an Iraqi translator who was working with the United States, based on some delicate information, was able to locate him. And he was literally hiding underground in what's called a spider hole. So Saddam Hussein, this powerful dictator who had all of these lookalikes, and he lived in luxury, and he had, gold silverware and 24 karat gold weapons, and just this total traditional, stereotypical dictator was literally camping out and living underground. After he is captured, he is turned over to the Iraqi people, where he's put on trial for his genocide against the Kurds. And after a trial, he is found guilty, and he is sentenced to execution, which took place in 2006. As I mentioned earlier, the Iraq debacle really looks a lot like the Vietnam War or the Soviet-Afghan War, in that the United States really never had a clear victory path or path to victory, nor did they have a clear exit strategy, meaning they didn't know how they were going to leave this place. So in the end, this was a war that lasted almost 10 years, and it cost billions and billions and billions of dollars. You cannot forget that as the United States is fighting in Iraq for about 10 years, they're also fighting a completely separate war in Afghanistan at the same time. So this is an era where the United States really went from being in a pretty good financial situation to one where they're paying for two wars at the same time. And so the United States economy will definitely feel the weight of this and will really slow down. And unfortunately, the reason for going to war, to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, were never found. Now, does that mean they didn't exist? No. I mean, maybe they were destroyed, maybe they were hidden. But if that's your reason for going to war and then you don't find them, then you just look silly. Critics like to point out that the real reason the United States wanted to go into the Middle East was to gain more access to oil. So the United States, when they leave, they have to train the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police force literally from scratch in order to keep the peace. However, the peace process has been very difficult because, as I mentioned in an earlier video, you really have three main groups within Iraq. You have Kurds, you have Sunnis, and you have Shia. So this is a very difficult country to establish any type of lasting peace with so many different divisions. Officially, the United States left Iraq in December of 2011. However, the war in Afghanistan continues to go on to this day. The biggest victory in the last few years of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq was when Osama bin Laden was found and he was killed in a special forces attack in Pakistan. This is the compound in the middle of nowhere in Pakistan. That's right, Pakistan, not Afghanistan, but Pakistan, where Osama bin Laden had been hiding. Now, I mentioned Pakistan because Pakistani forces were supposed to be helping search for Osama bin Laden, but obviously there are a lot of people loyal to him in this region. So if you can notice here, this diagram is pretty intense. all sorts of tall walls. You can see here it says trash burning location. They're not even taking their trash outside. They're burning it so that nobody knows who's inside. Opaque windows, meaning they have blackout screens. They knew when the satellite sort of imagery was being taken every day, so you never got a clear shot of him in terms of a clear photograph. And so it took actually a doctor who was really working for the United States to confirm that Osama bin Laden was there. And this was in a movie called Zero Dark 30. The last 30 minutes of it is about the raid. And you basically have 2 helicopters full of Navy SEALs who go to this little compound and kill Osama bin Laden. And they take his body and they actually bury him at sea, which is according to a Muslim tradition. Because if they showed the pictures and they did something else with his body, then they were afraid that they may incite all sorts of anger among the Muslim world. In a sense, by killing bin Laden, you really have some closure because you killed the guy who was the mastermind of attacks on the World Trade Center, on the USS Cole, on embassies in Tanzania, in Kenya. And so this really will bring an end to this era of the war on terror. It still continues, however, Al-Qaeda is not as strong as they once were with Osama bin Laden in control. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something. Hope you guys have a great day. Goodbye.